It wasn't until my dog started throwing up black sludge that I realized something was deeply wrong with my rainwater tank. At first, I thought it was just some clogged filters or a one-off algae bloom from last week's heatwave. But then I unscrewed the inspection cap and nearly passed out from the stench of burned motor oil. My carefully maintained, eco-friendly rainwater system was swimming in thick, toxic goo. Before I could even process that, I checked the security footage. There she was, HOA Karen, sneaking into my yard in broad daylight, lugging two 5-gallon jugs like she was on some bizarre workout routine. She popped the lid off my primary collection barrel, looked around, and then poured every last drop in. Just before walking off like she hadn't poisoned my entire water supply, she glanced right at my security cam, flipped it off, and smirked. That was the exact moment I knew she wasn't just petty, she was criminal. I wasn't going to let this one go. My name is Alex, and I live in a modest but self-sufficient home on the outskirts of a nice neighborhood that unfortunately happens to have one of the most aggressive homeowners associations in the state. I built this rainwater collection system myself, a combination of underground tanks, solar-powered UV filtration, and custom piping that reroutes excess runoff to my native plant garden. It's my pride and joy. My dogs drink from it, my vegetables rely on it, and heck, during last year's drought, even some of my neighbors came by with jugs. Everyone knew it worked, everyone except Karen. Karen, the HOA president, has always had it out for me. To be fair, she's got it out for everyone who doesn't fit her aesthetic of beige fences, trimmed hedges, and zero imagination. She once fined a neighbor for putting up wind chimes because the sound disturbed her Labrador's emotional balance. Another time, she demanded that a Vietnam vet remove his American flag on Memorial Day because it was not consistent with the community's color palette. But my crime? I had rain barrels and solar panels. I had the nerve to try and live green in her kingdom of conformity, and clearly, I was about to pay for it. I stood there, stunned, staring at the footage looping back to that smirk. It wasn't just vandalism, it wasn't a prank. She deliberately dumped toxic waste into my water system. That's environmental sabotage. That's poison. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. This wasn't some garden variety HOA nonsense anymore, this was a felony. But instead of reacting with fists or shouting matches, I smiled. Because what Karen didn't know, what she could never have predicted, is that I'm not just a guy with a green thumb and a bunch of tanks. I'm a certified environmental systems engineer with 10 years of experience working for state disaster relief and 5 working directly with the EPA on water safety projects. I design systems like this for a living, and more importantly, I document everything. After draining the top layers of sludge with the help of my siphon pump and collecting multiple samples into lab-grade containers, I sealed them, labeled them, and stored them in my cold box. I knew exactly what to test for: hydrocarbon concentrations, metallic residue, and any synthetic additives that could pinpoint the oil type and maybe even its brand. But before that, I had to make sure this wasn't just an isolated act of madness. Was Karen targeting only me, or was she on a little oil dumping crusade? So I started asking around, subtly. Turns out, I wasn't the only one dealing with weird garden failures and dead fish in backyard ponds. My neighbor Marta said her koi pond turned into a black swamp overnight. 2 houses down, Mr. Frank said his pressure washer spewed brown water from the tank he filled weekly. Something told me Karen had done more than just pour oil in one tank. She had declared war on any kind of water storage system that didn't come from a municipal faucet. Meanwhile, at the next HOA meeting, Karen stood there in her pastel sweater set like nothing had happened. She greeted everyone with fake charm, handed out leaflets about acceptable exterior decor, and gave me a dirty look like I was the one who'd poured oil in her cereal. I didn't say a word, not yet. I wanted to gather more data, find out where she got the oil, if she acted alone, and most importantly, if I could get her for contaminating the protected runoff stream that passed through the south side of the neighborhood. Because here's the kicker, that little stream, which receives overflow from several properties, connects to a state-protected wetland zone just 2 miles south. If Karen's sludge made it down there, which I suspected it had, then we weren't just talking about vandalism anymore. We were talking about a state and potentially federal violation. Suddenly, HOA Karen was looking a lot more like EPA defendant number 001. The next morning, I installed 2 more hidden cameras and upgraded my motion sensors. I also reviewed my old permit files, pulled out my backup tank logs, and reconstructed the exact volume of water Karen had poisoned. I traced the overflow piping, took samples from the drainage ditch near her property, and even found black streaks along the curb where a slow leak had trickled downward. Each data point made the case stronger, each photo and reading added weight to my suspicion. Karen wasn't just being spiteful, she was being systematic. Just when I thought I couldn't be more disgusted, I made a stop at the local Automax store to pick up a few filters and ask a casual question about their used oil disposal. Turns out, a woman matching Karen's description had bought 2 5-gallon containers of bulk synthetic motor oil 3 days prior, paid in cash. The clerk even joked about how she looked like she didn't know the difference between a carburetor and a coffee pot. I asked if they had cameras. He said yes. I asked if I could get a timestamp. He laughed and said, "You at the EPA or something?" I just smiled and said, "Something like that." By the end of the week, I had water samples, oil residue, photos, timestamps, witness statements, and video evidence. I had a folder so thick it looked like I was preparing for a criminal trial, which, in a way, I was. Because once I ran this by the right people, Karen wasn't just going to lose her HOA presidency, she was going to lose a lot more than that. She thought dumping oil into a rainwater tank was just a personal protest against my ugly barrels. She thought no one would notice or care. But she didn't know I built those systems from scratch. She didn't know I worked with the government. And she definitely didn't know I'd make it my mission to make sure she faced the full weight of environmental law. So when I finally picked up the phone and called my old supervisor from the EPA, I didn't hesitate. I just said, "Remember when you told me to call if I ever found someone dumping used oil into a runoff system?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, I've got a case for you, and you're going to want to bring a camera." By the time the EPA returned my call, I had already built a case that would have made a prosecutor drool. My old supervisor, Daniel, didn't even wait for me to finish describing what Karen had done. The moment I mentioned used motor oil and the proximity of a protected waterway, he cut in and said, "We'll have a field team there by Friday." That gave me 3 days to tie up the last few loose ends. Because as airtight as my evidence already felt, I wanted to be certain Karen wasn't just going to get a slap on the wrist. I was aiming for felony charges, and I wanted them to stick like oil on a duck. Karen, meanwhile, was doubling down on the facade. She strutted around the neighborhood with that self-important gait, still passing out printed notices with passive-aggressive quotes about preserving beauty and avoiding unsightly clutter. Her favorite new term was aesthetic integrity. She was using it to shame a neighbor for painting their mailbox blue. I could hardly keep a straight face when she posted a flyer warning residents about unauthorized water collection being a potential breeding ground for mosquitoes. Subtle? No. But definitely aimed at me. The best part? I knew she had no idea I was already 3 steps ahead and that an official environmental investigation was about to land squarely on her HOA headquarters like a wrecking ball. As part of my final prep, I ran another full chemical analysis on the contaminated tank water. The test results were exactly what I expected, off-the-charts hydrocarbons, zinc phosphates, and a synthetic additive that's exclusive to 2 major oil brands. The compound breakdown was almost identical to the used oil Karen had purchased at Automax. I took the results, the time-stamped receipt image I got from the store manager, and overlaid them with my surveillance footage. The timelines matched perfectly. She bought the oil, waited a day, and dumped it the following afternoon. Case closed, right? Almost. I still didn't have proof that Karen had done this more than once, but something in my gut told me she had. Marta's koi pond didn't turn into an oil slick from one act of vandalism. Mr. Frank's pressure washer didn't start spitting tar from bad luck. If Karen had dumped once, she likely had a pattern. So I went out for a walk, clipboard in hand, and played it casual. I told my neighbors I was documenting water issues for a personal filtration study. Within an hour, 4 more residents told me about bizarre water discoloration, oily smells, and unexplained film near their spouts. One even showed me a collection barrel where the surface shimmered like a rainbow. We took a sample on the spot and tested it with a quick kit, same contaminant, same residue, same telltale markers. Back home, I began mapping out the affected houses. They all shared one thing in common: proximity to Karen's property or one of the HOA's common maintenance sheds. That's when another theory hit me. What if she wasn't just using oil from Automax? What if she had a stash, some kind of bulk dumping operation that gave her easy access? I couldn't shake the idea, it just made too much sense. So I started watching her. Over the next 2 days, I adjusted my outdoor cameras, positioning one discreetly across from her house. It wasn't long before I got something useful. On Thursday afternoon, Karen loaded her trunk with what looked like heavy containers and drove off alone. I tailed her, careful not to get too close. She pulled into a dingy, out-of-the-way self-storage facility on the edge of town. She used a keypad to access a unit, backed in, and disappeared for nearly 20 minutes. When she came back out, her trunk was empty. That confirmed it, she was storing used oil. Why? I didn't know, but I was about to find out. Friday morning came fast. The EPA team arrived in plain vehicles, dressed like utility workers. Daniel greeted me with a grin that told me he was enjoying this just as much as I was. I briefed them on everything: maps, footage, samples, timestamps. I handed over my entire folder of evidence. They brought specialized test kits and began taking their own readings from my tanks, my garden soil, the neighborhood drainage grates, and the protected stream behind our development. Within hours, they confirmed everything. Contamination levels were so high in the runoff zone that Daniel muttered, "She's going to need a team of lawyers and a miracle." But Karen didn't know any of this was happening. She was busy preparing for that weekend's HOA Spring Beautification Tour, where she intended to walk new potential buyers through the community and show off her vision of suburban perfection. That made the timing all the sweeter. Because just as she was setting up folding chairs and decorative signs near the HOA office, the EPA team walked in with a warrant and started asking questions. Karen, never one to handle authority well, immediately switched to her fake nice voice. "Oh, gentlemen, I didn't realize we had an inspection scheduled. You must be from the local gardening society." Daniel flashed his badge. "Environmental Protection Agency, ma'am. We're conducting a contamination investigation following reports of illegal dumping in this community. We need access to HOA property, including any maintenance sheds, and recorded HOA meeting notes from the past 6 months." Her face cracked right there. I don't know if it was fear or rage, but something in her expression twisted. "This is ridiculous. There's been no dumping. I would have known, I'm the president." The EPA agents didn't even blink. While 2 officers kept her talking, the rest began sweeping the storage sheds. Within 30 minutes, they found a stack of 5-gallon drums. Some were empty, others were still full, and all of them had the exact oil composition identified in my contaminated tank. But it got worse. One of the barrels had a label that read, "Drain and Save, Karen B," in faded marker. Daniel looked at her. She looked at him. Then she screamed, "This is a setup. That's not mine. Someone planted it." But no one believed her. The EPA team didn't arrest her on the spot, they didn't need to. They had what they came for. Chain of custody protocols were followed, samples were bagged, and photos were taken. Karen was given an official notice of investigation and informed that felony charges were being prepared pending final lab results. As the EPA team packed up, neighbors gathered nearby, whispering and pointing. I heard someone say, she's finally getting what she deserves. Another added, wonder if we can vote her out now. Karen stomped back to her car, trembling, muttering something about conspiracies and environmental witch hunts. But me? I stood there feeling lighter than I had in months. I wasn't smiling out of pettiness, I was smiling because justice, real justice, was finally in motion. And Karen had no clue how much worse it was about to get. The irony of watching Karen unravel under the pressure of her own oily schemes was almost too perfect. After years of her acting like queen of the cul-de-sac, her empire was finally showing cracks, and not the kind you could fill in with HOA-approved beige caulk. But the investigation wasn't just about proving she dumped used motor oil into my rainwater tanks or my neighbor's barrels, that was already underway. The EPA was methodical, thorough, and had enough evidence to begin drafting official charges. But I still had one nagging feeling that hadn't gone away. Something didn't sit right. Karen wasn't the type to get her hands dirty unless she felt absolutely safe. It felt too clean, too practiced, almost like this wasn't her first time. I spent the weekend retracing her steps. I drove past that same storage unit where she was spotted unloading jugs. This time, I rented a unit for myself directly across from hers. If she came back, I'd have a front row seat. I installed a camera inside the doorframe of my unit, motion-triggered, silent, and discreet. On Sunday morning, like clockwork, Karen's SUV rolled in again. She parked quickly, got out wearing oversized sunglasses and a hoodie, Karen's version of a disguise, and opened her unit. Inside, I caught clear footage of her shuffling several containers. She even checked the seal on one of the larger barrels. Then she did something that really caught my attention. She picked up a clipboard, flipped through what looked like pages of checklists, and made a few marks. That wasn't casual dumping, that was logistics. That was tracking. My gut was right, she wasn't just dumping oil for revenge. She was stockpiling it, maybe even distributing it. I handed the footage off to Daniel at the EPA, who raised an eyebrow so high it nearly disappeared into his hairline. This is organized, he said flatly. And if she's moving product or disposing of it systematically across residential areas, it could escalate to environmental trafficking, especially if she's violating hazardous material disposal laws. That changed everything. Suddenly, this wasn't just about a neighborhood feud, it was about potential environmental crime on a wider scale. And I knew Karen wasn't smart enough to pull this off alone. So I started digging, not literally, though the thought of unearthing a barrel of sludge in her rose garden crossed my mind, but digitally. I requested public records for HOA purchases and property maintenance logs dating back 3 years. Most of it was benign, full of receipts for landscaping and overcharged pressure washing. But tucked into the expenses were repeated payments to a company called Clear Sky Waste Solutions, supposedly for oil collection and disposal every 3 months. That didn't make sense. We weren't a community with commercial kitchens or garages, why were they contracting oil disposal? I called the number listed for Clear Sky. A guy answered in a voice that sounded like he'd just woken up inside a gravel pit. When I asked about their services for our HOA, he paused, then said, we don't service residential neighborhoods. I asked again, mentioning Karen by name. The line went dead. Now it was really getting interesting. I gave the number to Daniel. Within 2 days, the EPA confirmed that Clear Sky had been flagged before for improper waste handling in another state. They were being watched, and Karen had apparently been doing business with them. Back in the neighborhood, Karen was starting to sense that the tide had turned. She stopped showing up to HOA events and sent out an email claiming she was on medical leave due to stress. But her cronies, especially Mara, her vice president and biggest gossip conduit, were still hanging around, trying to prop her up. At a board meeting that Monday night, Mara stood up and declared the investigation a witch hunt led by an angry man with barrels in his yard and a vendetta against community standards. I didn't even flinch. I simply pulled out a printed copy of the EPA's preliminary report and handed it to the board chair. Mara turned as white as her oversized pearl necklace. After that, the board went quiet. Karen's defenders started stepping back, clearly worried about going down with her. Meanwhile, Daniel and the EPA team filed for access to Karen's financials and HOA discretionary spending records. That's when the story blew wide open. Turns out, Karen had been laundering HOA funds through fake maintenance contracts and using that money to pay for private oil pickups and possibly illegal disposals. The deeper they dug, the worse it got: misuse of community funds, fraudulent bookkeeping, illegal dumping across multiple properties. But the final nail in the coffin came from the unlikeliest of sources: her ex-husband. I hadn't spoken to the guy before, but apparently, when news of the EPA raid hit the local news, he came forward to the agency himself. He told them that during their marriage, Karen had a habit of getting rid of things in her own way. After their divorce, she had poured used oil over his backyard garden as revenge for getting the house. She had also once tried to report him for toxic waste to the city while she was the one doing the dumping. He even had old photos of barrels and notes scribbled in the same handwriting as the clipboard I caught on camera. With his testimony, the EPA added a pattern of behavior to her case file. That week, Karen's house was officially searched. Agents arrived with a warrant, and the neighborhood gathered like it was a Sunday picnic. Her garage was full of bins, gloves, funnels, and boxes labeled with vehicle types and oil brands. She had built an entire system for collecting, cataloging, and presumably disposing of oil. I overheard one agent say, "This is more organized than some chop shops." Karen wasn't home at the time, she'd vanished 2 nights earlier. But she couldn't hide forever. Within 24 hours, she was located at a relative's house 2 counties over and served with a formal list of charges. They hit her with everything: felony illegal dumping, misappropriation of HOA funds, conspiracy to commit environmental violations, and endangering a protected waterway. The charges were enough to ensure that even the slickest lawyer wouldn't be able to spin it into a misunderstanding. Karen was going to trial, and I was going to make sure every last bit of evidence saw the light of day. But even as the legal machinery started to roll, I couldn't help but reflect on just how far this whole mess had spiraled. What started as a suspicious smell in my rain tank had grown into a federal case involving fraud, environmental damage, and criminal conspiracy. The woman who once yelled at me for having unsightly moss near my rain barrels had turned out to be running a toxic oil network out of her garage. And the funniest part? All she had to do was leave my water tanks alone. Now, with Karen facing serious prison time and the EPA moving to formally strip her of her HOA privileges, I knew the storm was only beginning for her. And for the rest of us, it was finally the calm after years of dealing with her tyranny. But I wasn't done yet. Because while she was getting fitted for an orange jumpsuit, I had one more surprise in store for the neighborhood. And it involved turning the very thing she hated most into the biggest symbol of justice this community had ever seen. Karen's trial was scheduled 3 weeks after the EPA completed their full report, and let me tell you, those 3 weeks felt like a victory parade in slow motion. Word of what she'd done had spread like wildfire, neighbors whispering at mailboxes, moms on morning walks suddenly giving me thumbs-ups, even grumpy Mr. Collins from 2 doors down offered me a nod of respect. It was surreal. The same people who once rolled their eyes at my rain barrels were now calling me the guy who took down Karen. I didn't care about the attention. What I cared about was seeing her finally face consequences, real ones, not a fine she could pay off with HOA funds, not a stern warning she'd ignore, but court, lawyers, and a judge who wouldn't be swayed by sweater sets or saccharine charm. The courthouse was packed on day 1. Karen walked in, flanked by her attorney, a smug man in an expensive suit who looked like he specialized in sleaze. Karen herself looked different, no longer the queen of the cul-de-sac, but tired, sunken, and clearly rattled. She didn't acknowledge anyone as she entered, not even Mara, who sat awkwardly behind her and avoided eye contact with everyone else. Meanwhile, I sat on the witness bench with Daniel from the EPA, the state environmental investigator, and a few of the neighbors who'd agreed to testify. My folder of evidence sat in my lap, thicker than ever, loaded with timelines, photos, receipts, footage, and scientific reports so thorough they could have been published in a journal. Her defense strategy was almost laughable. Her lawyers started with a bizarre claim that she was being framed by environmental extremists trying to undermine her position as a strong female leader in the HOA community. The jury looked unimpressed. He pivoted to blaming faulty plumbing and weather patterns, suggesting the rainwater contamination might have been caused by industrial runoff or even naturally occurring hydrocarbons in the soil. But when he attempted to dismiss the video footage of her pouring oil directly into my tanks, the room fell into stunned silence. The prosecution let the footage play twice, once for the jury, once just to make sure the point was clear. There was Karen, as bold as ever, dumping those jugs in broad daylight. The camera even caught the brand logo on the side of the container and her unmistakable smug face before she flipped it off. The prosecutor was calm and methodical. She laid out the entire timeline, the initial contamination, my discovery, the EPA involvement, the storage unit footage, the financial records showing misuse of HOA funds, and finally the search of her property where dozens of barrels had been found, some of them still full. Each piece clicked together like gears in a clock, and every tick brought us closer to a verdict Karen could feel in her bones. And just when it couldn't get worse for her, the prosecution called in a surprise witness, her ex-husband. He stepped up to the stand with a kind of reluctant confidence. His testimony was damning. He described how, during their divorce, Karen had destroyed his backyard vegetable garden by dumping oil into the soil, how she bragged about it later, calling it justice, how she referred to environmentally conscious neighbors as cultists and barrel freaks. He even provided old messages and handwritten notes that matched the ones found on her clipboard. One of them included a list titled HOA to eliminate, and right there at the top, Alex's barrels. Karen's face went stiff as marble. Her lawyer tried to object, claiming emotional manipulation, but the judge allowed it. It wasn't emotional, it was evidence of a pattern, a long, deliberate campaign of harassment disguised as community management. When my turn came, I stood before the court and walked them through the science. I explained how rainwater systems work, how oil contaminates not just tanks but the entire filtration line, how the runoff had affected the local stream, and what that meant for the protected wetland beyond. I described the fingerprint match of the synthetic compound, the correlation between the barrels found in her storage unit and the oil in my tanks, and the brand tracking that led to the purchase receipt. I kept it simple, clear, and polite, no smugness, no anger, just facts. Then I showed them the map of affected homes. I walked through each one, how Karen had selected them, what they had in common, and how her personal notes had correlated with who got hit and when. It wasn't random, it was targeted. The jury listened, stone-faced. Even the judge leaned forward at points. By the time I stepped down, there was no doubt left. She had done it. She had planned it. And she had done it with malice. The final moments of the trial were quiet, no outbursts, no last-minute denials. The jury took less than an hour. When they returned, the room held its breath. Guilty on all counts, felony environmental damage, misuse of community funds, illegal dumping, and endangerment of protected ecosystems. Her lawyer looked like someone had deflated him. Karen just sat there, blinking, as if it hadn't sunk in yet. The sentencing hearing came 2 days later. She was ordered to pay restitution to all affected homeowners, including me, cover the environmental cleanup fees, and forfeit her role in any HOA activity permanently. But the biggest hit? She was sentenced to 18 months of supervised probation with mandatory community service cleaning hazardous roadside waste under county supervision. She was also barred from handling or storing any regulated materials ever again. When she walked out of court that day, the only thing missing was a Walk of Shame music track. The local paper ran the headline, HOA President Faces Felony Charges Over Oil Dumping Scheme. The online forums lit up. A Reddit post about the trial trended for 2 days straight. People from other states started sharing their Karen HOA horror stories, and a few even reached out to ask how I documented everything so well. I was happy to share, because if there's one thing this ordeal taught me, it's that when people think no one's watching, they'll show you who they really are. And Karen? She'd shown us all, in oily detail. Back in the neighborhood, things started to shift. The HOA board voted to remove her name from all documents. A new election was called. I wasn't planning on running, but several neighbors urged me to. They said the neighborhood needed someone who knew how to keep things clean, literally and figuratively. I didn't say yes, not yet. I needed time to fix what Karen had broken, not just with oil but with fear, control, and fake rules no one had ever agreed to. She had tried to rule through intimidation. Now we had a chance to lead through common sense. But before I moved on to the next phase of cleanup, I had one small project left, one final touch. Because after everything Karen had tried to destroy, I wanted to turn the tables in the most poetic way possible, not with revenge, but with legacy. And it all started with a sign I'd been waiting months to put up, one that would make Karen scream into the void when she saw it. Because sometimes, the best justice is letting the whole world know exactly who you are and exactly who beat you at your own game. The day after Karen's sentencing, the neighborhood felt like it had collectively exhaled for the first time in years. The air was lighter, the sidewalks a little friendlier, and for once, people weren't afraid to leave garden gnomes or paint their mailboxes something other than white. A few neighbors even organized a small gathering on the green belt, not to celebrate her downfall exactly, but to reclaim the space she'd once dominated with her ridiculous rules and condescending stares. Kids ran around, someone brought cookies, and there was music, not HOA-approved elevator music, but real music with laughter in the background. It was healing. And while everyone seemed ready to move on, I had one last thing I needed to do before closing the book on this oily chapter of suburban warfare. Over the next few weeks, I rebuilt my rainwater system from the ground up. The contamination had done serious damage, and though I'd salvaged what I could, I wasn't taking any chances. This time, I installed tamper-proof hatches, added extra filtration, and installed smart sensors to alert me of any change in chemical composition. If a single drop of anything besides rain touched those tanks, I'd know about it within seconds. Not that I expected a repeat performance. Karen was out of the picture, barred from even touching a watering can, but still, peace of mind is worth its weight in platinum. The best part was the community support. Neighbors I'd never spoken to offered help. Marta donated a new UV filter. Frank dropped off some spare tubing from his workshop. Even grumpy Mr. Collins came by with a box of hose fittings, mumbling something about doing it right this time. I thanked each of them, not just for the supplies, but for proving that people could be decent when they weren't being micromanaged by a tyrant in a pantsuit. Rebuilding the system became a community effort, and that alone was something Karen could never have orchestrated with all her fake charm and printed flyers. A few weeks later, the HOA held its special election. I hadn't planned to run, truly, but after everything, people kept showing up at my door with coffee and homemade flyers, asking me to consider it. I wasn't interested in control, I just didn't want the next Karen slipping in while everyone was still recovering from the last. So I agreed, but on one condition. I'd only do it if the board adopted new transparency rules, environmental protections, and a policy allowing homeowners to vote on changes to bylaws instead of being told what to do. To my surprise, not only did they agree, they applauded it. Apparently, I wasn't the only one tired of rule by whim. The election wasn't even close. Karen's last remaining supporters didn't stand a chance. The board was reshaped with normal, reasonable people who cared more about gardens and neighbors than lawn height violations and curtain color. My first act as president was to clear up the ridiculous restrictions Karen had put in place on sustainable living. Rainwater systems, native landscaping, even solar panels, all of it was now permitted, encouraged even. We issued a neighborhood guide with practical advice, cost-saving tips, and a list of local resources for going green. Within a month, for new homes had rain barrels, and someone even started a community compost bin. It felt like progress, the good kind. But I wasn't done yet. I still had my one last surprise. It was something I'd been planning quietly, tucked away in my garage alongside tubing and tank parts, a sign. Not just any sign, an artfully made wooden plaque, handcrafted by a local artisan and mounted near the entrance of my rebuilt rainwater system. It read, "This system was nearly destroyed by ignorance and malice. It now stands as a monument to resilience, truth, and clean water. May we never forget the mess one person can make, or how much stronger we are together when we clean it up." Below the quote, in small, subtle lettering, was a final line, dedicated to Karen B. "Thanks for the inspiration." The day I installed it, people came by to read it, and the reactions were everything I hoped for. Some laughed, some nodded in quiet approval. Marta clapped. Mr. Collins actually chuckled and said, "She's going to love that." And maybe she would, in her own twisted way. After all, she always wanted recognition. Now she had it, immortalized in wood under a filtration system she once tried to poison. Poetic justice is often slow, but when it arrives, it's sweeter than any HOA newsletter. Of course, Karen wasn't completely gone. She'd been relocated to a rental house several towns over, and as part of her community service, she was spotted in a bright orange vest picking up roadside trash alongside highways. Someone took a photo and posted it in our neighborhood group chat, no caption, just a visual reminder that sometimes the system works, even if it takes a while. No one commented, but everyone saw it, and that was enough. Months passed, and the neighborhood flourished without Karen's constant interference. People actually started caring more, not less. Yards looked better because they were personal, not cookie-cutter. People were friendlier because no one was getting passive-aggressive letters about bird feeders. The community found its rhythm again. And me? I kept my system humming, kept helping neighbors build their own, and once a month, I led a local workshop on sustainable home upgrades. It wasn't flashy, but it was meaningful, real impact. Looking back, it's still wild to think how everything unraveled from one act of sabotage, one person, one bad decision, and a whole web of lies that stretched from a rain barrel all the way to a federal courtroom. But maybe that's how it works, big changes come from small moments. And if Karen hadn't dumped that oil, if she'd just moved on or minded her business, maybe we'd all still be stuck in her petty dictatorship. But she did, and because of that, she forced the truth into the open. She forced people to pick a side, and in the end, they chose something better. So no, I don't regret the fight. I don't regret the hours I spent collecting samples or the weeks of testifying. I don't regret dragging it all into the light. Because what Karen saw as an eyesore turned out to be a symbol. What she tried to destroy became the thing that fixed the whole neighborhood. And now, every time I hear the rain tapping gently on the roof, flowing down into those barrels and filtering through the system we built together, I smile. Because that sound isn't just water, it's justice. It's community. It's a future no amount of oil can ever taint.